This story is a subscriber-submitted story, written by Robert Estes for his son Colin. Since I was a little kid, all I could remember was living in apartments. I recall the small rooms, the noisy neighbors, the cramped feeling of always having lots of people around me. Apartments are, well, they're okay, I guess. But kids never really get a chance to explore the world when they live in apartments. And sure, there was a small playground at the apartment complex where we lived, but all the kids played there. And it was crowded most of the time, so playing there wasn't much fun. Let me tell you, it gets kind of old when you have to wait a long time just to get your turn on the slide or the swings. I remember looking out my tiny bedroom window after dark. I remember that the playground was always empty at night, but Mom would never let me play outside in the dark, no matter how much I begged. She'd always say there were too many creepy people around here, or that the city isn't a safe place for a kid. I mean, heck, at the apartments where we lived, there wasn't even room to fly kites. And I'd never flown a kite, ever. And even though I'm a senior in high school now, I've always wanted to have a real yard to just run around in, to crawl in the grass, to climb trees. And, well, I still want to fly a kite. So, I was very excited when Mom and Dad told me that they were finally going to move out of the apartment, and we would soon be moving into a full-sized real house of our very own. A few months ago, they bought an old farm. It was huge. Well, kind of huge. It was 23 acres of land, which was huge to me, and they were building a new house there. A brand new house. We were going to live in a brand new house. It was incredible. And one day, Dad took me out to our then almost finished house and walked me around inside. He showed me that I was getting my own full-sized bedroom. I was thrilled. No more tiny apartment bedrooms with teeny tiny closets. It was awesome. And the farm had lots of flat land, with a long line of trees along the back area. It had a huge yard, with even more trees to climb. And there was plenty of yard to run and play in, and lots of room to fly kites. But, well, I'm a little too old to actually do most of that stuff now, but at least I can if I want to. Near the back of the property, back near the tree line, was a very old, run-down farmhouse. It looked like it had been abandoned for 50 years or more. Its old tin roof had totally rusted and was peeling off, and all the windows were broken out. The old house was so small, I almost believe our old apartment was bigger than it. It had long since been gutted inside, almost falling down in places, and the extent of decay and utter dilapidation was eerie to a degree that I can't even begin to explain, as though the building deliberately refused to succumb to the ravages of time. The air smelled of something rotting, and even during the middle of the day, for some odd reason, it would still be dark inside. It just didn't seem... well, it didn't seem right. This old farmhouse was about, 100 yards from our new house, though it was the length of a football field away. It sat in plain sight of our house, well, within sight of our back door. Dad told me he was going to tear off the outside walls and finish ripping out the house interior, and was going to turn it into a barn for my grandmother's 2 horses. Granny was too old to care for her horses now, so Dad was going to keep them at our new farm. He asked me if I'd like to help him strip out the old insides of the farmhouse. I was thrilled. I jumped at the chance to help. So even before we moved into our new house, he and I were tearing out old rotted floors and pulling down plaster walls inside the place. We worked late afternoons and weekends, and we soon got the old run-down farmhouse converted into a nice barn, just like Dad planned. Our new house was finally finished a few weeks later, and we moved in right away. And then, last week, we brought Granny's horses over to the new barn. But something weird happened right from the start. The horses didn't want to go inside. They kicked and bucked. They pulled against the reins and the guide ropes. Their eyes flared open wide, like they were terrified. They just didn't want to go into their new home. It was just a barn made out of an old house. So what could be wrong? The plan was for me to feed the horses every afternoon after school. I would get to brush them down, feed and water them, and in general help Dad care for them. I loved being out in the open country like this. I loved this farm. All this wonderful free space surrounded me. I couldn't wait to ride a horse sometime soon. I noticed something wrong when I fed them that first day, though. They had fresh blood, a little bit of it, around each of their mouths. They seemed to be breathing very heavily, and they even coughed and choked from time to time. I went and told Dad, and he came and checked their mouths, but he couldn't find from where they were bleeding. He said they probably had bitten their tongues or something like that, and told me to give it a few days, and it'd probably clear up. The next afternoon, after school, I went to feed the horses again. They were now bleeding from their ears. Just a little bit again, but it was quite noticeable. I got Dad. He was upset, but he didn't know what to make of it. On the third day, the horses were bleeding from their eyes. The whites of their eyes were totally red, beyond bloodshot, as if they were leaking blood. Patches of deep red blood had dried up, caked heavily in the corners of their eyes. Spatters of blood covered the floors of their stalls, dripping from their still bleeding mouths. Now at this time, Dad called the vet to come check them. He performed several exams, going over them from head to hoof, but he couldn't figure it out. He didn't know what was wrong. He said all he knew for sure was that the horses were very weak. Totally exhausted, he said, like they hadn't slept in several days, was how he described it. He thought maybe they had eaten something poisonous, so he took samples of their stool droppings and put them in plastic bags. He said he'd call us in a few days with the test results, and then he left. On day 4, the horses were covered in small cut marks. Well, slashes, like they had been attacked by the claws of an animal. In a few places, thin streaks of deep raw flesh was exposed, and lots of dried blood caked on their hides. Before sundown, the horses couldn't stand. They were just too weak, and I was afraid that they were dying. Dad checked the barn high and low and said that there was no way, absolutely no way, for any animal bigger than a mouse to get into the barn. Dad decided he would camp out in the barn that night, and he said he was taking a shotgun and a flashlight with him. After dinner, about sundown, Dad ordered me to stay inside the house. He said if I did go down there, he might shoot me in the dark, thinking I was a wild animal or something outside. Mom locked the doors after Dad left. From the living room window, I watched him walk down the 100-yard-long path to the barn, and he disappeared inside. Now I watched TV for a bit, but nothing happened, and soon I had to go to bed. Mom made me. But a tiny voice in the back of my mind screamed that the horses hadn't been poisoned, but had fallen victim to some form of supernatural decay or curse caused by the abandoned farmhouse. Now, my bedroom didn't face the barn. It was on the front side of the house, so I wasn't able to see if anything did happen anyway, and I eventually fell asleep. Sometime after midnight, a horrible noise came from outside. Even from inside the house, I could hear the horses howl and snort and screech in sheer terror. Mom turned on the porch light and forbid me to go outside. She stood at the door, but she didn't unlock it. She cried, though she tried not to. And honestly, well, I was on the verge of crying too. I stood next to her, looking out the window, hoping to see some sign of Dad in the darkness outside. But the horrible animal noises continued. They were horrendous. The horses brayed and whinnied in agony, as if they were being slaughtered. Not only that, but we heard loud banging and slamming sounds too, like the horses were trying to kick their way out of the barn. I think they were actually trying to kick the walls down so that they could get out, so that they could get away. But we didn't hear gunshots, nor did we hear Dad yelling. We couldn't even see if his flashlight was on or not. "It's gotta be a bear, it's gotta be," Mom kept mumbling to herself. The whole area around the barn was black, pitch black, solid black, like a huge curtain of absolute darkness was now covering everything down there. She pressed her face to the door window, straining to see into the darkness where the barn was, and the insane animal sounds just suddenly stopped. A bizarre and unearthly howl, that's really the only way I know how to describe it, pierced the night air, and I backed away from the door quickly. Mom turned and ran from the door. She fled down the hall and locked herself in the bedroom. And through the darkness, in the area of the barn, I saw a tiny glimmer of light, like a candle in the distance, and it rose and fell, and it rose and fell again, and it moved erratically, getting closer and closer to our house. It was as though the light were coming out of a fog, a black, thick, evil fog that hung over the barn. And it was Dad. His flashlight was growing brighter, as if the further he got away from the barn, the more it returned to its normal brightness. As Dad reached the porch, I flung open the door and ran out to get him. He was covered in blood. Splatters, smears, and streaks of it were on his clothes, just top to bottom. I asked him if he was hurt, but he said he was okay. However, he fell to his knees as I got him inside the house. He shivered uncontrollably. His body was very cold, as though he'd been out in a snowstorm for hours. He began to cry, and he collapsed forward onto the floor of the entrance hallway. Between heaving sobs, he kept mumbling about the horses. Oh God, the poor horses. And I snatched up his flashlight and ran out the door, my legs pumping madly as I flew down the pathway to the barn. The fog-like blackness that hung around the barn lifted as I approached. I was furious. Someone or something had attacked our horses, and my dad had barely escaped it. I was going to kill whoever or whatever made the mistake of crossing my path in the next few seconds. As I neared the barn door, I used the flashlight to look around quickly. Nothing unusual was around outside, so I went into the barn. Dad's shotgun was laying on the floor just inside the door, or should I say, what was left of his shotgun. It was now just a twisted piece of junk metal, twisted and bent and broken, like it was made of rubber, not steel or iron. The stench of blood. It was palpable. I fought back the urge to vomit. As I approached the horse stalls, I saw that several wooden planks had been ripped off the walls. As I suspected, the horses had tried to kick through the walls, trying to get away from whatever had attacked them. I inched closer to the first horse stall, shining the flashlight into it, and I could barely make out what was inside. I stepped into the stall and froze at what I found. The horse was dead, completely. and utterly mutilated. I'm not going to go on to the specifics of what I saw with the horses. All I'm going to tell you was that it was gruesome. There was blood everywhere. A huge pool of it covered the stall floor, and it was slung on the walls and even splattered on the ceiling. I didn't check the other stall. I grabbed Dad's shotgun and ran back to the house to check on him. Getting back inside, I found that Mom had moved him to the kitchen table. He was trembling horribly. She had cleaned him up a little bit, wiping off as much blood as possible, and he was trying to drink water from a glass. His hand shook uncontrollably, so she held it for him. Dad eventually calmed down, and soon after, he called the sheriff. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived a short time later. They interviewed Dad inside the house, him still sitting at the kitchen table, and try as they may, he refused to take them down to the barn to show them where it all happened. I brought them Dad's shotgun and they seemed a little freaked out about the damage to it. I eventually volunteered to take them down to the barn, even though reluctantly, and, well, Dad did object at first, but they assured him that I'd be safe with them there beside me. They retrieved flashlights from their patrol car, and as we neared the barn, they grew nervous and drew their pistols from their holsters. They ordered me to stay just outside the door, and then they went in. I heard one of them gasp in amazement, and I heard the other one vomit. After only a minute, they came back out, the look of disgust and shock heavy on their faces. They both rubbed the soles of their shoes in the grass, trying to get the blood off of them. They talked amongst themselves for a moment, and then we went back into the house. One of them told Dad they would fill out their police report when they got back to their office, and that we could pick it up any time after tomorrow. He said we should take the police report to our insurance company to receive reimbursement for the 2 dead horses. This all occurred last week. Dad's been in bed every day since then. This has really messed with his head. He's a nervous wreck, and I'm worried about him. I know he loved the horses and all, but whatever attacked them was too big and powerful for him to stop. Like Mom said that night, it had to have been a bear. He won't come out to eat. He makes Mom bring food to him in the bedroom. He won't even let me come in to see him. He makes me talk to him from the doorway, and he absolutely refuses to discuss anything about that night. And then, last night, after they went to bed, I heard Mom crying. She and Dad were talking for a very long time. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they both seemed upset. I snuck from my bedroom into the hall and tried to listen at their bedroom door. I accidentally bumped the door and I heard Mom scream in terror. The door flew open and she was standing there, fighting back tears. Dad moaned painfully and quickly pulled the covers up over his head. He coughed heavily as he told me to go away, but I couldn't stand it any longer. So I ran inside and I yanked the bedsheets off my dad. His body was thin and frail. The slash marks that were on the horses covered him now too. His eyes and ears were bleeding, and he was even coughing up blood. I was now even more certain my idea of there being a curse was true. Dad threw his hands in front of his face and began to cry, and through his sobbing he managed to say, "Oh God, the thing in the barn told me it's going to kill us because we destroyed its home. Son, I'm sorry. You're next." My mind swam in disbelief, my body frozen by terror. Dad had seen the thing that killed the horses. It talked. It hadn't been a bear. It had actually talked to him. And the air grew cold around us, Near darkness seemed to fill the entire house. On Dad's side of the bed, something huge faded into existence, appearing from nothingness. And across the front of its huge black bulbous head, it had almost a dozen large spider eyes. They seemed to glow with an almost unholy light. Many long and spider-like gangly arms hung from just below its head where its neck should be, but it didn't have one. It didn't have shoulders either. Its upper body was a morbidly obese stump with hundreds of small, wriggling worm-like appendages enveloping it. And this all sat atop 3 thick legs, which more resembled a tripod of twisted tree trunks than legs. Dad lay in bed, frozen in absolute terror. His eyes told me that this was the thing he had encountered in the barn last week. It rose higher on its massive legs, the top of its head touching the ceiling, and it leaned over towards Dad, seeming to hover directly over him. Dad was so tiny below this thing, and he lay there, helpless. It smiled. Its mouth was immense and seemed to wrap around the sides of its head. Hundreds of jagged teeth that resembled more like countless shards of broken glass than teeth filled the inside of its gaping maw. Mom grabbed me and dragged me out of the bedroom, and we fled down the hallway through the near darkness. The bedroom door slammed shut behind us, and then Dad began screaming. We bolted from the house and sought safety in our car. Mom started the engine and turned to me to say something, but she recoiled in horror, just pointing at me, mouth agape. And that's when I felt it. Blood trickling from my eyes, dripping from my face like sweat. And I began to cough, the bitter metallic taste of the blood filling my mouth. Dad was right. I would be the thing's next victim. And very soon.